Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Today, we are going to talk about gangs and drugs, the two national threats. The brief overview of this lecture is going to go thus forth that when a gang engages in violence or crime, it becomes an issue for law enforcement to deal with. The gang problem in America is exceedingly complex. The gang problem is often intertwined with other social and criminal justice problems. Law enforcement must know how to deal with gangs effectively, and many gangs are not involved in drugs, either using or selling. All right, so let's start with gangs. A definition commonly accepted by law enforcement is that a gang is any group gathering continuously to commit antisocial behavior. I know that might sound silly, it's very broad, but it gets the job done. For the purposes of this discussion that we're having now, we'll define a gang as a group of individuals with a recognized name and symbols who form and basically an allegiance together for a common purpose and engage in unlawful activity. A broadly applicable definition of street gangs has evolved from intense discussions among working groups of American and European gang researchers over, 6 years, in an assembly that has been come to be referred to colloquially as the Eurogang program. The Eurogang consensus nominal definition of a street gang is any durable street-oriented youth group whose own identity includes involvement in illegal activity. Now, having a uniform definition would benefit law enforcement community in several ways. They did a study, the National Youth Gang Survey Analysis, and they found that in general, law enforcement agencies report that group criminality is of the greatest importance, and the presence of leadership is the least importance in defining a gang, which is super important. And two, additionally, law enforcement agencies tend to emphasize the same definitional characteristics in defining a gang, irrespective of the year of gang onset, which basically means that there's a lot of similar characteristics, regardless. They're essentially timeless. So the percent of law enforcement agencies reporting a gang problem as of 2009 was 17% in rural counties, which was pretty low, 33% in smaller cities, 52% in suburban counties, and 86.3% in large cities. Essentially, the more densely populated the area is, the higher likelihood that there's gang issues, and that increases seemingly um, pretty linearly. These percentages have remained fairly stable from those reported in 2006, indicating the gang problem has neither increased nor decreased substantially in that 5-year window. However, gang prevalence trend data collected by the National Gang Center, NGC, which tracks the distribution of the level of the gang problem across the United States, shows that the gang prevalence rates in 2009 were significantly elevated when compared to 2000 and 2001. So I think it's pretty safe to say the gang problem has actually increased in the past decade. These findings are supported by the results from the 2011 National Gang Threat Assessment, which was developed by the National Gang Intelligence Center, NGIC, if you want to refer to them as their acronym, and the National Drug Intelligence Center. Both agencies of the Justice Department um, essentially said the gangs continue to commit criminal activity, recruit new members in urban, suburban, and rural regions across the United States, and develop criminal associations that expand their influence over criminal enterprises, particularly street level drug sales. Now, the most notable trends of 2011 have been the overall increase in gang membership and the expansion of criminal street gangs' control over street level drug sales and collaboration with rival gangs over other criminal organizations. Now, to be clear, it is actually unclear exactly how many gangs and gang members' activity exist in the United States. Obviously, they don't make that information public. The gangs I'm talking about, not the police, although the police might not want to make it public either. Perhaps because of the differing definitions used to identify such activity membership. For example, there's a study in 2008 which estimates that 30,000 gangs are actively operating within the country with a total membership of around 800,000. However, according to the NGTA, which remembers the National Gang Threat Assessment, um, found that there are more than 33,000 gangs throughout the United States, which is approximately 10% increase from that study in 2008, and found that there's approximately 1.4 million active gang members on the streets. So, and that's almost a double from what the other estimated, being around 800,000. All right, so just as there are many ways to define gangs, there are also many ways to classify or put them into a type. Some common ways are things like ethnicity or region of origin, criminal activity, and location of the activity. So I think it's probably put best. There is no one form of a street gang. Gangs can be large or small, long-term or short-term, more or less territorial, um, more or less criminally involved, and so on. If one treats all gangs as being the same, then the treatment will often be wrong, perhaps even making things worse. And it is the fact of gang diversity itself that should make us cautious about generalizing too quickly about their nature. Compressed gangs, primarily adolescent groups of 50 to 100 members, and less than 10 years of duration, which means they're relatively new, are the most common, found in both large and small cities. Least common are collective gangs, which are rather amorphous, but large collections with little internal structure, sometimes held together by like a loose neighborhood tie or even extensive drug dealing. The smallest in size of five types, but the most tightly structured is the specialty gang, which is not versatile like the other four types, but rather manifests a narrow pattern of criminal behavior. Drug gangs, robbery or burglary gangs, car theft gangs, skinheads are all common examples. Although gangs are still male dominated, female gang membership is on the rise in many communities throughout the United States. There's some research that exists, very limited though, on the prevalence of activities for females in gangs and being gang members to date. Female gangs have been infrequently been focused on by law enforcement. So consequently, police are often less likely to recognize or even stop female gang members. Now, although many, if not all, gangs are organized around race and ethnicity and are highly homogenous with respect to this variable, some street gangs are more racially or ethnically heterogeneous in their membership, which means they're basically mixed. Such mixed race and mixed ethnicity groups are known as hybrid gangs, a term that originally referred to a gang's ethnic or racial composition. Hybrid gangs in which several small groups, some of them rivals, band together into a large gang, which can be highly violent. Members of hybrid gangs are generally young and participate primarily for profit. These gangs thrive in areas with relatively new gang problems and often include gangbangers, I guess, who have migrated from larger cities. These gangs present a sea, basically, of changing gang culture and bear little resemblance to traditional gangs. Unlike older gangs based on race and neighborhood loyalty, this new generation is singularly focused on making money from drugs, robbery, prostitution, things like that, anything related to vice. All right, now there are many factors for why people join gangs. The most commonly cited ones are the youth dropping out of school, high employment rate among youth and young adults, family disorganization, cultural transition when you're basically moving to a new area, acceptance and protection by the gang, and also economic opportunity, in particular where areas where there are none. All right, so some gang experts talk about the three R's of gang culture: reputation, respect, and revenge. Reputation is of prime concern to the gang members, both individually and collectively. They expect, indeed demand, respect. And they are required to show disrespect for rival gang members, basically called a diss in gang slang, if you will, but that's been pretty well adopted to common day vernacular. Now, disrespect inevitably leads to the third R, revenge. Every challenge must be answered, often in the form of violence. Noted criminologist David Kennedy is quoted saying, The code of the street has reached a point where not responding to a slight can destroy a reputation, while violence is a sure way to enhance it. Gang members have differing levels of commitment and involvement in gang activities. Most gang members are either hardcore, associate, or peripheral members. The hardcore members are those most dedicated to the gang. Knowing how a gang is organized and what level of involvement a member has can be of great assistance to investigators. The hardcore gang member is the least likely to cooperate with police. The peripheral members are the most likely to be cooperative. A gang's degree of organization influences the behavior observed among its members, something to keep in mind, with even low levels of organization having important implications regarding criminality. I think it's best put, indeed, even incremental increases in gang organization are related to increased involvement in offending and victimization. Now, so street gang members, we all know they're engaged in a wide variety of illegal activities, from underage drinking and vandalism to drug use and drug selling, petty theft, auto theft, robbery, homicide. Uh, and although most gang crimes consist of relatively minor offenses such as property damage, theft, things of that sort, they are more serious, albeit infrequent crimes such as robbery, assault, murder. Then they're going to garner more publicity. It is these more serious crimes that capture media attention, create fear in the communities, and end up receiving the most concerted attention and efforts from the police officers and courts. Now, disagreement exists about what comes first, so to speak, with gangs. Is it gang involvement or criminal activity? Some contend that joining a gang leads youths into criminal activity, while others assert criminality is already there. Or in other words, criminally minded youth are more likely to become gang involved. Several studies have shown that although most youths were delinquent before joining a gang, their delinquency increased as a result of joining. There have been some research that has showed that even after controlling for individual level attributes, which means the characteristics and facts about an individual gang member, individuals who join gangs commit more crimes than do non-gang members. When all other factors about them are compared or basically held the same as someone who had the same characteristics, same prior record that did not join a gang. Furthermore, the offending level of the gang members is higher when they report being active members of the gang. Therefore, gang membership clearly facilitates offending above and beyond individual level characteristics. All right, now many communities tend to go a little bit blind to local gang activity. However, gang members usually make their presence known. Um, Basically because they thrive on attention and recognition. It's part of staking their claim. They go unseen only when law enforcement officers, educators, and even parents fail to recognize the signs of gang activity. Such failure to recognize or even acknowledge the existence of gang activity, whether it be willingly or through a lack of gang identification training, dramatically increases a gang's ability to thrive and develop a power base. The first step in dealing with the gang problem, of course, is going to be to recognize it. Now that identifying specific gangs can be challenging, but a school or community can be aware of warning signs that gangs are a problem. So graffiti, obvious colors of clothing, tattoos, um, initiations, hand signals, handshakes, uncommon terms or phrases, and just a sudden change in behavior. All right, so gang members take pride in belonging to their specific gangs, and they're going to make their membership known in a variety of ways. This can usually come in names, clothing, tattoos, sign language, slang, graffiti. Typically, many gang members will actually have something called a moniker, which is something that refers to basically, their street name. The color and type of clothing can also indicate gang membership. For example, Bloods are identified by red or green colors. Crips are usually associated with blue and purple bandanas or scarves. Many have tattoos, and they frequently flash hand signs or use sign language for quick communication. Now, because each gang has its own distinct hand signing, displaying such signs, also called throwing down, can be used to identify one another, show respect to peers, and even to respect a rival gang. Gang members speak a distinct language. And knowing street slang can help officers identify persons as gang members and facilitate communication with those individuals during interviews and interrogations. In the field, police officers are likely to hear gang related street lingo, such as set, mix, 38, 50. Just the list is going to go on and on because it's evolving, ever changing. Because space limitations, I'm not going to go through an entire list of slang officers might find useful. However, many online resources are available to familiarize people with such slang, and it's usually actually pretty well updated. Now, moving on from that. Many gangs establish a specific area, or they mostly call their turf, which they mark by graffiti. Graffiti, remember, it's symbols and slogans written on walls and the side of buildings, which they will defend basically to death. They control their turf through intimidation and violence. Police officers can learn a lot about gang activity if graffiti appears in their jurisdiction. Graffiti may list gang members' names, often in order of authority. The most graffiti will appear in the center of their turf. Graffiti crossed out or written over is often a challenge of a rival gang, and if gang symbols are written upside down, the graffiti is usually written by a rival gang, and it is a great insult to the gang it depicts. Something else to point out, gang members caught crossing out into rivals' graffiti are often severely beaten, and in some cases are even killed. All right, so let's talk about the investigative procedures for dealing with gangs. The same procedures used in investigating any other kind of illegal activity apply to investigating gangs. Information and evidence must support the elements of specific offenses and link gang members to those offenses. It's difficult to obtain information about gang, or at least their legal activities, because the gang members tend to stick together and will intimidate the people living and working within their turf. Business people and residents alike, they're usually fearful of telling the police anything because the gang will harm them if they do. Furthermore, many immigrant communities who may be easy targets for gang victimization have a basic distrust of law enforcement because of government corruption in their home countries, which only compounds the problem. Many of the same gang members who commit crimes against the immigrants may be related in some way or be children or family friends. Makes it even more complicated. Other challenges faced in dealing with victimized immigrant populations, which can seriously thwart the effectiveness of police investigation, are the language and cultural barriers. If a neighborhood canvass is conducted and information is received, it is important that the canvass not stop at that point, which means you're supposed to go around and take inventory of everything. That would essentially implicate the house or business at which the canvass was terminated as the source of information. So once you start and you get information, even if it's valuable, you have to keep on going because you don't want to, make anyone or highlight anyone as a snitch, basically, and get them in trouble. In addition, more information might be available from sources not yet contacted during the canvass, so also going to be valuable. Now, crime scenes that involve gangs are unique. Often, the crime scene is part of a chain of events. When a gang assault occurs, for example, other stuff happened. Often a chase preceded the assault, considerably widening the crime scene. If vehicles are involved, the assault is probably by a rival gang. If no vehicles appear to be involved, the suspect is probably local, perhaps even the members of the same gang as the victim. This frequently occurs when narcotics, girlfriends or family disputes are involved. Evidence obtained in gang investigations is processed the same way as well. All right, so the National Gang Center has published a revised edition of the best practices to address community gang problems back in 2010, and they identify 5 core strategies that can be used as a comprehensive tool to combat gang problems. The 5 general strategies are community mobilization, opportunities provision, social intervention, suppression, which includes law enforcement efforts, and organizational change and development. Now, the most effective approach is to use a combination of these strategies, but essentially get the community on your side. Make sure there are opportunities for gang members to leave, like viable economic opportunities. Have a social safety net there to help with the social intervention. So aside from in the community, maybe getting family members involved, people who actually have influence. Suppression, which is what the police can do, involve actually stopping gang efforts, and organizational change and development coming from not only the community, but also from law enforcement. Now, there is a comprehensive gang model, which is actually highlighted in the text, which was already introduced previously as based on the years of experimentation and research on gang prevention. But the model has proven to be pretty effective. The model's key distinguishing feature is that it has a strategic planning process that empowers communities to assess their own gang problems and fashion anti-gang strategies appropriately. So let's look at some of the let's look at the model and highlights, which result from the National Youth Gang Center survey. And also should point out that also had a meeting of experienced practitioners in this. So let's look at their 5-prong approach. Firstly, primary prevention. Primary prevention targets the entire population in high crime, high risk communities. The key component is a one-stop resource center that makes services accessible and visible to community members. Services include prenatal and infant care, after school activities, truancy, and dropout prevention and job programs. And next, secondary prevention, which identifies young children, typically ages 7 to 14 at high risk, and drawing on the resources of schools, community-based organizations, and even faith-based groups, intervenes with appropriate services before early problem behaviors turn into serious delinquent and gang involvement. Intervention targets achieve similar stuff by targeting gang members, active gang members. So intervention look at gang members, close associates, and even gang members returning from confinement, and involves aggressive outreach and recruitment activity. Support services for gang-involved youths and their families help youths make positive choices. There's suppression, which focuses on identifying the most dangerous and influential gang members and removing them from the community. Re-entry targets essentially serious offenders who are returning to the community after confinement and provides appropriate services and monitoring. Of particular interest are the displaced gang members who may cause conflict by attempting to reassert their former gang roles, kind of like leaders who want to take charge again, only to be told that no one wants them to take charge, and that's usually how violence occurs. The first 2 prongs of this program focuses on prevention, which is also the objective of the GREAT program, which we're going to talk about. All right, so let's look at GREAT, because I know we briefly discussed it before. We also talked about DARE, but GREAT is the Gang Resistance Education Training Program, which is nationally proven approach aimed at stopping gang membership. Its proactive approach seeks to deter violence before it begins. This school-based law enforcement officer-instructed classroom curriculum was developed in partnership with the nationally recognized organizations such as Boys and Girls Club of America and the National Association of Police Athletic Leagues, and it is intended as an immunization against delinquency, youth violence, and gang memberships. The program builds on the foundation focused on teaching children life skills that they need to avoid violence and gang membership. Now, a study supported by the National Institute of Justice, so the NIJ, documented that students who graduated from the GREAT courses showed lower levels of delinquency, impulse behavior, risk-taking behavior, and approval of violence. The study also found that students demonstrated higher levels of self-esteem, parental attachment, commitment to positive peers, anti-gang attitudes, perceived educational opportunities, and positive school environments. So it's a lot going in there. All right, so a gang problem is not just a law enforcement problem. A community must provide its young people with meaningful alternatives to draw them away from gangs, such as educational programs, social interaction, recreational activities, and development opportunities. Providing these services will require cooperation among parents, families, schools, social services, businesses, religious organizations, and other neighborhood resources. As noted earlier, The biggest cause of gangs is we do nothing for the 90% who aren't gang members. If all the attention and respect goes to the gang members, then what happens to the kids who aren't getting the attention and who are actually getting beat up by the gang members? Where else are they going to go? All right, so police departments are starting to, if they haven't already, they're very aware of the fact that gangs are an issue. The Commission of Accreditation and Law Enforcement Agency Standards, so CLEA, they actually include the control of vice, drugs, and organized crime in one standard, acknowledging that some departments may have three separate divisions dealing with these challenges, which can be difficult because even though they're all like, supposed to be arms of the same body, which, the body being the police department, they don't always cooperate, talk to each other effectively, which can be an issue. So because organized crime is often heavily into drugs, and some departments consider both crime, both groups, drug users, people operate in organized crime as gangs. The three areas are starting to be combined into one standard, which again has its pros and it has its cons. But I think one of the biggest challenges here that I'm trying to highlight is the fact that there's large expenditures of money, and we all know that there's a large and pretty substantive linkage between drug use, drug abuse, and gang activity. But sometimes the dots aren't always being connected on the side of the officers. Not necessarily that they don't know that they're connected, but the resources are not being connected properly. The divisions are separate, so they need to be able to communicate properly. All right, so let's talk about the drain on the economy. Um, Gangs are not the only faction involved in dealing drugs. Organized crime is also heavily into this area, and some are reputable business people. Drugs and drug using behavior have been linked to crime in many ways. Research supports the link between street level drugs, hotspot activity, disorder, and serious crime. So in addition, the use of illicit drugs is a major cause of the soaring rates of incarceration, which an estimated 2/3 of federal and state prisoners and probationers are characterized as being involved in some way with drugs. Now, you might ask yourself, how does that directly link to the economy? Well, one, we got to pay to keep them in there, and two, they're not contributing to the economy. The National Drug Threat Assessment in 2011 states that the trafficking and abuse of illicit drugs in the United States create an enormous drain on the economic, physical, and social health of American society. So let me just go through some statistics here so we can really put this into perspective. The abuse of several major illicit drugs, including heroin, marijuana, methamphetamine, appears to be increasing, especially amongst the young. Marijuana use among adolescent students have begun to increase after a decade of decline. It is estimated that about 9% of Americans aged 12 or older, or about 22 million individuals, were current illicit drug users. And actually in 2009, a a statistical increase shown of around 8% from 2008. The abuse of controlled prescription drugs, so CPDs, rank second only to the abuse of marijuana, with about 7 million individuals aged 12 or older estimated to have been current non-medical users of controlled prescription drugs. According to the latest available data, the number of prescription overdose deaths exceeds the number of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine deaths combined. Mexican-based transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, dominate the supply, trafficking, and wholesale distribution of most illicit drugs in the United States. The southwest border remains the primary gateway for moving illicit drugs into the U.S. The estimated economic cost of illicit drug use to society 10 years ago, mind you, was more than $193 billion. The NDIC estimates that an annual cost of drug-related crime is more than 61 billion. The threat posed by trafficking and abuse of illicit drugs will not abate or basically go down in any time in the near future. Matter of fact, it's probably going to go up. Put it into perspective, over the last several years, we have witnessed a remarkable increase in horrific Level of drug violence, even in places like Mexico. In 2008, more than 6,200 people died as a result of drug-related violence. Um, and just halfway through the year in 2009, 1,000 people, including police officers, judges, and prosecutors, soldiers, journalists, politicians, even innocent bystanders, they've all been killed. Mexican drug cartels are now present in at least 230 US cities. And this is an increase from about 50 cities in 2006. All right, so let's talk about the wide spectrum of drugs. Marijuana is the most controversial illicit drug, mostly because it has a wide spectrum of opinion already existing on its harmfulness and whether it should be legalized or not. It is worth noting, though, that marijuana has taken a back seat with teens because it has lately been kind of ignored for its pain relieving properties, with most surveys actually showing that there's been more first time users using things like painkillers rather than marijuana for that purpose. A far link between drugs and crime is pretty well established. Data from the National Drug Threat Survey indicate that crack cocaine and methamphetamine are the drugs that are most often to contribute to crime. Heroin was reported to be a significant contributor to property crime. A comprehensive collection of the drug fact sheets, including photographs, street names, methods of abuse, overdose effects, and legal status in the United States is all available actually online from the DA or the Drug Enforcement Administration if anyone's interested. Some drugs can be identified with a narcotics field test. Now, identification via field testing, however, can be tricky. Most of these drugs tend to be in pill or powder forms that could be pure, uncut dope, or baking soda, marijuana, or oregano. Um, and people that market them aren't widely known for giving reverence to truth and labeling, if you know what I mean. So basically, you don't really know what you're getting. Several brands of self-contained single-dose test kits are available that reduce the likelihood of user error and require very small samples. Um, Officers must actually understand that field testing cannot be used to establish probable cause, which is actually very important. It can only confirm it. Probable cause, through observations and evaluation of other factors, must already exist before a substance can be field tested. So, for example, put this into perspective, an undercover officer who buys a small bag of white powder from a suspect from a suspected cocaine dealer has established probable cause and may run a substance-specific field test for cocaine because, the action of actually buying it. That's how they establish probable cause. All right, so one tool to help law enforcement agencies investigate drug trafficking is the DEA's National Drug Pointer Index, which is a nationwide database that became operational across the United States in 1997. The NDPIX is intended to enhance agent slash officer safety, eliminate duplication, increase formation sharing and coordination, and minimize costs by using existing technology and 24-hour access to information through an effective, secure law enforcement telecommunications system. Now, some investigative aids are not so high tech. They don't have as much, technical language. For example, some dogs are being used to detect drugs, and this has been common for decades because of their keen sense of smell, which enables them to detect, minute traces of illicit drugs. Canines are effective force multipliers as well. So, they're far more likely to cause extreme damage really fast, I guess. Or maybe that might not be the best way to say it. I guess another way to say it is that canines can also put a hurting on people. Law enforcement agencies depend on their canines and handlers for many tasks essential to police work, with drug detection topping the list. 90% of surveyed agencies report they use dogs for this purpose. The Supreme Court has ruled that a canine sniff in a public area or during a lawful traffic stop is not a Fourth Amendment search. Remember, assuming the lawfulness of a detention, which is a stop based on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, merely running a canine around a vehicle or container does not constitute a Fourth Amendment search and does not need to be independently justified. However, use of narcotics detection dogs to sniff at the door of an apartment or home has been ruled as a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment and therefore requires a warrant. Another asset for investigators is the special high accuracy laser ranging finder developed in the US Customs Service. Investigators use the unit to measure the interior dimensions of cargo containers in their search for hidden compartments where drugs may be smuggled. The small laser beam allows measurements of loaded containers in which physical access to the rear wall is limited. The handheld battery operated laser ranger finds measured distances from 6 to 85 feet with an accuracy of 1 inch. So an accuracy of 1 inch. So it's extremely accurate. Flying drones also being used by the U.S. Forest Service to battle pot growers operating in remote California woodlands. These pilotless camera-equipped aircrafts allow law enforcement to pinpoint marijuana fields and size up potential dangers before agents attempt arrests. All right, so let's look at approaches to dealing with the drug problem. A summary of the findings from all pretty rigorous academic studies evaluating the range of street-level drug law enforcement interventions found that strategic crime control partnerships with a range of third parties are more effective at disrupting drug problems than law enforcement only approaches, which means they can't do it alone, right? So here's some of the suggested ways in which you can approach this: crime control, punishment, rehabilitation, prevention, and legalization. Now, the approaches being suggested should help support the priorities of having a control strategy. So let's look at those. Because this does always fall within the domain of law enforcement, but not only exclusively. So strengthening efforts to prevent drug use in our communities, seeking early intervention opportunities in healthcare, integrating treatment for substance and disorders into healthcare, and supporting recovery, breaking the cycle of drug use, crime, delinquency, and incarceration, disrupting domestic drug trafficking production, strengthening internal partnerships within the communities, looking at developing international partnerships, improving information systems that better analyze, assess, and address local drug use and its consequences. Now, efforts at international source control and national interdiction are beyond the scope of what we're kind of talking about here. But it is worth noting that, however, local enforcement efforts are of great importance in the efforts to address the drug problem. These efforts often involve drug buys, undercover operations, and raids, all which can't be done without law enforcement, and most of which can be done more effectively with local buy-in and community support. All right, so let's look at how officers can potentially deal with street level dealing. Typically, three different types of approaches: attack to demand, which is a way to scare off buyers; attack to supply, slow the dealer's business down as much as possible; and three, alter the environment. Make the environment or area too hot for dealers and buyers. The greatest deterrent to drug dealing is officer presence. Although it's probably a combination of the three, particularly with demand, not necessarily scaring off the buyers, but maybe reducing the demand altogether by reducing the desire to do the drugs, but whatever. Now, just being in the area is in a marked unit will actually scare off drug buyers and dealers, but it can be and often is displaced. Now, citizens know where drug dealing is going on, and if they can be encouraged to report such events, police can concentrate their efforts on those locations receiving the most complaints. Often, police officers want to go higher than the street pusher, but should avoid this temptation. If information regarding someone higher up is obtained, it should be given to the narcotics unit for follow-up basically as soon as possible. The main purpose of the street level raid is to respond to citizens' complaints and to let them see their complaints being acted on, arrests being made. Officers should know where to search a person being detained on suspicion of possession of drugs. The variety of hiding places for illegal drugs is limited only by the violators' ingenuity. You get what I'm saying? Common hiding places include body orifices, boots, chewing gum packets, cigarettes, coat linings, cuffs, false heels, hair, hat bands, inside ties, lighters, pants, pens and pencils, seams, shoes, shoulder pads, sleeves, and waistbands, just to name a few. Police-led crackdowns and cleanups, such as like weed and seed initiatives, have been effective in some communities. These programs target drug hotspots, and during and after the crackdown, the targeted areas receive other services aimed at enhancing the quality of life, including like code enforcement, litter removal, and streetlight repair. All right, let's look at governmental power. The government has the power to finance the war on drugs by seizing the drug traffickers' illegally obtained assets. This includes cars and weapons, as well as cash. Among items that have been seized are airplanes, vehicles, radio transmitters with scanners, telephone scramblers, paper shredders, electronic currency counters, assault rifles, and electronic stun guns. Asset forfeiture is another form of punishment. It's important to remember that. The U.S. Marshal Service administers the Department of Justice's asset forfeiture program, managing and disposing of properties seized and forfeited by federal law enforcement agencies and U.S. attorneys nationwide. Now, their goals are to enforce the law, improve law enforcement cooperation, and enhance law enforcement through revenue sharing. Commonly seized assets include, real physical property, vehicles, vessels, aircraft, businesses, financial instruments, and jewelry. Under the Equitable Sharing Program, proceeds from the sale of forfeited assets are often shared with local and state law enforcement agencies that participated in the investigation, leading to the seizure, enhancing the cooperation between state and local agencies and federal agencies. Now, cops actually, now I'm talking about the actual cops office itself, not an actual individual cop, has published a guide on asset forfeiture that describes applying asset forfeiture to specific crimes. It examines legal arguments for its use, discusses the benefits and consequences of its use, and provides recommendations for launching an asset forfeiture program if your local PD wants to do so. Now, it's important to note that similar to legislation aimed at a gang problem, recent legislation such as drug abatement statutes is also helping in the federal government combat drugs. Such legislation makes it easier to shut down things like crack houses and clandestine drug laboratories. Drug abatement statutes declare any property where illegal drugs are used or sold to be a public nuisance. Areas in which new legislation would help include things like drive-by shootings, witness protection programs, lowering the age on juvenile offenses, continuing the examination of the criminal enterprise, examining loitering, and also pointing a weapon from a vehicle. Any of these things could identify these as new areas where law enforcement can have invigorated effort and attention to look at. All right, so let's focus on some known risks and prevention. So just as it's always preferable to prevent physical illness rather than treating it, it's also preferable to prevent drug problems rather than treating it after the fact. One problem associated with drug abuse is the transmission of HIV infections when drug addicts use and share needles. There's something called the Needle Exchange Program, or NEP, which have found to significantly decrease the spread of HIV infections among intravenous drug users. One effective way to approach prevention is to focus on the known risks. The same factors placing youths at risks for joining gangs can also make them at risk for using drugs or alcohol. Things like community risk factors, which include extreme economic deprivation, low neighborhood attachment and community disorganization, transitions and mobility, community laws and norms favorable to drug use, firearms and crime, availability of firearms, and the media portrayal of violence. There are some school risk factors that should be explored, things like early and persistent antisocial behavior, academic failure beginning in elementary school, and the lack of commitment to school. There's family risk factors, which include history of the problem behaviors, I guess we want to put it, family management problems, family conflict, and unfavorable parental attitudes and involvement. There's individual and peer risk factors, which include alienation and rebelliousness, early initiation of problem behaviors, friends who engage in problem behaviors, and favorable attitudes towards problematic behaviors. Yeah, it's not enough also to just identify the risks. Programs need to be put in place to keep the youth from abusing drugs or joining gangs. Educational programs like DARE, which we discussed previously, is important. And we also discussed the OJJDPs, basically playbook for stopping people from using drugs. One of them is getting them involved in a youth athletic program. Most coaches have special relationships with their athletes and can influence their thinking and behavior. Another approach might be to address what many see as a flaw in current drug education programs. One such flaw is to equate drug use with drug abuse, using the terms interchangeably, which is a shortcoming for sure, because teenagers know the difference. Another flaw is that the gateway theory, which is a mainstay in drug education, asserts that marijuana use leads to the use of harder drugs such as cocaine. There's no research or evidence to support this. The flaw basically provides a conflict in students' mind, which they observe and think that invalidates other things that they hear. There's definitely a correlation, but very, very weak causation, if that. It's probably pretty safe to say that most people who've tried harder drugs have also tried marijuana, but it's probably not correct to say that marijuana caused them to try other drugs. All right, so let's close this out by looking at the 5 categories of intervention. So firstly, we have international / national interventions, which is basically drug seizure, or taking of the assets. Reactive / directed interventions, so things like crackdowns, raids, buy bus, saturation patrol, reacting to the problem. Proactive partnerships and interventions, third-party policing, police-oriented policing, drug nuisance abatement, individualized interventions, arrests, referral, and diversion, and interventions that use a combination of reactive / directed and proactive partnership strategies. A review of this found that basically proactive interventions involving partnerships between the police and third party and or community entities appear to be the most effective than just any one of these solutions being used individually. Now, McCabe is a researcher who studied the relationship between serious crime, drug arrest, and nuisance abatement in 2008 and 2009 using New York City data from 1995 to 2000, a period in which the city experienced a dramatic decrease in crime. A lot of people said that this has to do with the broken windows theory that was implemented there. Basically, the idea is that if you let one small instance of criminality slide or you don't let it get addressed, it will fester and cause more crime in the future. So you have to stop everything at its source. Don't let anything slide. McCabe tested this theory using drug arrest and nuisance abatement closings as an approach to the drug problem. His research showed that the rate of marijuana arrests and the closing of drug locations through nuisance abatement statutes are inversely related to the crime rate. So basically, as one went up, the other one went down. So as the rate of marijuana arrests and the closing of the drug locations went up, the crime rate decreased. And that the rate of controlled substance arrests is directly related to the crime rate, which means that it also had a pretty direct effect. So, which is a nice way of saying that although he didn't want to definitively say that it had a strong relationship, it definitely had a relationship, and that it would appear that in part policing, particularly with the use of hotspot policing, closing down problematic areas, that did have an effect on the crime rate. It did seem to decrease it. All right, so let's finish this up by summarizing what we've discussed today. Firstly, the gang problem has increased over the past decade. 5 general strategies are being used right now to deal with the gang problems. Frequently, gangs and drugs are basically integrally related. Police often use simple drug buys, undercover operations, and raids to combat the drug problem, which is good, but it's not enough. And legislation can help, such as the drug abatement statutes. If you got this far, thank you. Just scan the QR code so I can take your attendance. And okay, this is what we went over today thus far. We finished chapter 12, and I'm going to post a quiz on chapters 11 to 12, which should be due on Sunday. If you're listening to this now, I will probably post this on Thursday night or Friday morning, and along with me posting this, the quiz will be available. So thank you all for listening in, and I hope you enjoy your weekend. Good luck.